And you'll also see, and I've seen in my consulting work, that sometimes I'll come into a school and I will see that they want to change, but they're not willing to change and willing to change their ideas and their ways and their approaches towards discipline.
Change is difficult. Change is always difficult.
Very difficult. It is, but it seems that with us having this topic discussion today, that change is coming. Well, don't you agree, Merrill?
Yeah, I think it's going to have to. And, one of the points that I've made in our paper and that I make when I speak to people about this is that, institutions, and I don't mean residential facilities, I just mean like school as an institution, education as an institution. Institutions move very slowly. And the school is still playing, in my opinion, catch up to developmental services. Because, years ago, children that are in the schools now were not in the schools. They were in institutions. And when I was a child, when you guys were children, there were no special education classrooms. There were no people with severe behavior problems in the school. Now, I see some individuals, whose behavior is as severe as people that used to be in residential facilities. Some of them end up going to them. Some of them end up staying where they are. But I think that the schools in general are playing a tremendous amount of catch-up regarding proper training for their staff, regarding restraints and seclusions, and policies surrounding those, oversight, accountability. They lag well behind developmental services, and I'm still in developmental services too for like adults with disabilities in non-school settings, and they're not perfect either. But I think they have a lot more experience grappling with these issues in the educational system, and there's a tremendous amount of homogeneity and policies regarding persons when they're served in a residential facility as opposed to in school. And I think school's going to be playing catch up for some time, the educational system, and it needs to. And I think it's already this whole big hubbub in the media and lately is a great thing because it's kind of forcing the issue, which I think is fantastic, and I think they are going to start catching up.
Joe? You had mentioned earlier that the instances when restraints and seclusions are appropriate.
This is probably the most hotly debated of the topics right now that we're going to broach here. And, because many advocates will call for the complete banishment of both.
Yep.
Many will say that it's to be used. Some will even argue that it's therapeutic. So in between those two spectrums, is where the argument lies. Now, most programs, similar to what Merrill works with and everything else, and most other types of research and everything else will go up and say that most people will say it's for safety purposes only. In other words, is imminent danger to the child, to another student, or to a staff member.
What about property, Joe? That seems to be one of the defining lines.
That is, as far as the perspective from CCBD, is no. Because as a BD teacher, then you should be able to set up your ecological environment to protect those things so they're not in jeopardy. And that's from an experience type thing. So I'm not a proponent of that. I think it's the big issue with restraint itself is the research that I've done with schools trying to reduce the use of it is regardless of how well the staff was trained. I would give the surveys to the staff and they can spit it back exactly what their training program said. Well, I will only use this for this under these conditions. And then I go through their incident reports to find out why they actually incorporate restraint. The majority of it is non-compliance, nearly half of it. Another third is for leaving the assigned area.
Couldn't that be put the desk down? Couldn't that be a non-compliance issue?
Non-compliance, many times if you go in there, is basically not following teacher directions. Only 3% of the cases in which we did the surveys and going into the schools were actually used for what the training programs had trained the staff for. What happens is it becomes a culture within the school. And many of the training programs even caution at the end of the training programs, they go, just because we trained you in these neat little techniques now, doesn't mean you should go out and practice these techniques on students. But the problem is if it becomes a culture of acceptance, rather than de-escalation or positive interventions, staff rely on them too much. And if surveys have come out with the students, what their perception of it was risk. They even said, they go, certain staff members used it inordinately as opposed to other staff members. In other words, is the perspective that's out there is the majority of all these restraint procedures being used are used inappropriately. And that's one of the major problems with that. If you can actually reduce it to where and when it was needed, the majority of all of these would be gone. It wouldn't be an issue. It would only be a safety issue when somebody was. And I have been attacked. I've been bitten on the neck by students. I've been, had serious behavioral problems teaching residential, special day schools, and self-contained schools. But the majority of all restraints are uncalled for. While we try to pick him up, why don't I just again, because I never finished off with the definitions, just so we're all talking on the same thing.
Keep us on.
For the restraint was the two different types is basically an ambulatory or physical restraint. And that's when you're using your body to control another person's. And that's why Merrill was saying, physical escort is if I'm using my body to control it, that is a restraint. And the terminology is really important to clarify that. And then the second one for that is a mechanical, and that most people are very common with that, law enforcement, such as handcuffs. So using any type of device. Now, the court cases, a lot of my research is looking at what the researchers said. The courts have ruled on predominantly with, other than a few exceptions, such as a blanket hold or something along those lines, mechanical restraint, not allowed to do. Ambulatory or physical restraint, the courts have pretty much ruled and said that the schools are permitted to use that.
I see
it's
Merrill's
still
back
a very, and I was going to his definitions while we lost you there, buddy, so just come on back.
And specifically, we're talking about the idea of restraints in the physical side. If I remember right, the bills in Congress and in the Senate both really focus specifically on the physical, don't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, most of them call for, just as I said, most of the training programs out there now is for imminent danger of, the student or the staff is what both of the legislation was calling for.
Is this a physical restraint?
If you're controlling the concept, no, but if you're controlling me and preventing me from leaving by the technical aspect of an ambulatory or physical, if you're using your body to control me, then it would be contained as a restraint. The key is, and this is where the terminology is so important, is certain states claim that you can restrain a person as many times as you want during a day, but it only counts as one restraint.
Right.
And if you've ever worked in residential care, you'll see when a person's having a bad day, that could hide a lot of restraints that are being used
cycle
with the
of
student.
restraints.
A cycle of restraints, 7 or 8 within a day. The other ones are saying, as Merrill mentioned before, is if it's an escort, it doesn't count as a restraint. Well, if you're controlling my movement, again, that's a restraint. Others say if it happens less than 30 seconds, doesn't count as a restraint.
Of course, I've also had students who I'm in the transport with, and the minute I went to let them go, they would be gone. I mean, they would literally be gone. And I know I run pretty fast, but I'm not that fast.
Now, the issue is the safety concern on that. That's a serious concern with school. Like Iowa faced 2 lawsuits in the same year. One was both for child running away from campus. One was they restrained the child, and they go, well, you had no right to restrain my child, and they faced a lawsuit. The other one ran away, and guess what? Safety hazard, got hit by a car. They got sued. Why didn't he not restrain my child from the face? In other words, I understand the complexity of this issue from the school administration's perspective. It's a huge one, but that's where you have to go in. What CCBD was looking at was the functioning of the child. If you're dealing with a high school student, middle school student, could function well on his own out there, then no restraint is necessary.
But that's assuming they have a certain cognitive
functioning. If you're dealing with individuals who do not have that cognitive function, if they ran into the parking lot, would easily get hit by a car, then it is the obligation to stop and restrain to make sure for the safety of that student.